Hello, this is my recording for the PF Virtual Moot on the theme of self-care, a topic of which I'm not exactly a dazzling expert by any stretch of the imagination. So rather than talking about any of the more usual forms of self-care, I thought I would talk about something of which I've got a reasonable degree of knowledge and experience, namely storytelling. At one level, storytelling is obviously it's a very recreational thing to do. It's a very enjoyable thing both to hear, in terms of sitting and listening to other people tell stories, but also if you were telling a story yourself, and I do appreciate that the first few times at any rate, people are often very nervous, and if you're very nervous, you're less likely to enjoy something. But once you get into the flow of it, into the experience of it, then it becomes a very enjoyable experience, a very enjoyable thing to do and to engage with the audience. And any form of self-care arguably has to involve a certain degree of pleasure and enjoyment. If it's arduous and painful and unpleasant, is it really caring for yourself? Something I often find with those who are obsessed with recommending exercise, which I find unbelievably tedious, although I'm sure it has lots of health benefits. How do you make it engaging? But anyway, enough of my hang-ups and so on. To tell a story is to create a story. It's to create a time, a place, people, events to engage in a, fictitious environment. And even if the story you are telling is one based upon real events, you're recounting some historical, the rebellion of Boudica or whatever it might be, nonetheless, the way it's told becomes fictionalized. In much the same way as a film about the Second World War or whatever might be based upon specific, real, actual historical events, but the way it's recreated, the actors, the set design, everything, the lighting, makes the event fictitious. And it's the same in storytelling. So you are creating a fictional world and then inviting your audience to become part of it. So they're not just sitting there slack-jawed and listening in a very passive way. They are engaging. If the story has humour, it requires the audience to react with laughter, and you get a sense of what makes them laugh, which might be different from what makes some other audience laugh. If you're trying to create a ghost story with fear and a degree of fright, which can be just as relaxing as a funny story, strangely enough, again, you're gauging your audience's reaction as to when they go ooh and ah and shivers run up and down their spine and so on. So it's an interactive experience with that specific audience. I do know storytellers who memorize a script and will repeat it verbatim every single time they do that particular story. So it's essentially a theatrical performance. It's not, I would argue, storytelling, which will probably upset those storytellers out there who do memorise scripts. But there is a distinction between delivering a speech, a rehearsed speech, being Hamlet on stage, giving that speech, and sitting there face to face with your audience. And it may be that you're telling a story you've told 50 times in the past, but it becomes unique with each telling, with each audience, because you have to judge and react, and if it's a unique experience, you're engaging with that audience. You're maybe changing the language a little bit because this audience is very young and your previous audience were adults, or vice versa. Different educational levels in the audience. Will these ones understand great big long words, or will they prefer things in simpler language? All of that sort of thing as to how you spin that particular tale. So it's a form of interaction. It's an engagement. As Joyce Grenfell, the comedian of generations past, she said, each telling is a work between performer and audience, and therefore it has to be different each time. It has to be unique each time, and that is a form of creativity. It's a very intimate form of creativity that engages the emotions, both of the teller and of the hearer. And that in itself, that engagement of emotions, I would argue, is therapeutic, both for the audience and for the performer. There have been quite a number of therapeutic programs based around the idea of storytelling as a psychotherapeutic technique. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but as a therapeutic technique, a healing technique, a form of self-care, if you like. It's not only for the people who are listening, it's also for the person telling. And I often think those books and those websites run by clinics and so on, which are about the art of storytelling as a therapeutic technique within psychology and psychiatry, are so focused on the benefit to the patient, they forget that the therapist, the person telling the story, is also potentially benefiting from the telling of the tale. And it's got to be a two-way dynamic, rather than this sort of power imbalance of all of the focus being upon the patient and none on the therapist. The same way you could argue there's been a significant shift in teaching, between understanding that teaching is an interaction between student and teacher, and it's a shared focus, or at least it used to be in the past, to the children or young adults, whatever age group you're talking about, becoming the absolute focus of the teaching experience. The teacher becomes a cipher and a relevancy that's just shoveling information into students, and that's not a healthy style of education. It's not an effective style of education either, but it's a slightly separate issue. Those books, websites, clinical research and so on, looking at psychotherapy and storytelling, often take the idea from narrative psychology. Actually, there's several forms of narrative psychology, but we'll stick to the straightforward version at the moment. That we, each of us, tell our story. Some people tell it very overtly. You're sitting on the bus next to some rather garrulous stranger who starts telling you about their kids and their wife or husband and what they do for work and what their granny had for tea last night, and you get their entire life story in the space of a bus journey. Other people, it's like getting blood out of a stone to get information from them, but nonetheless we engage with other people and we tell them not necessarily a cohesive story, the kind of thing you'd read in a novel. It's usually just little bits of anecdotes. Oh, last night I did this, or we went to the theatre, we went to the cinema, we went to a football match, we saw this, we saw that, this is what we thought, this is what happened. And even if you are technically talking about what you saw at the cinema last week, or a sports match you went to last month, in talking about the event that you took part in, you can't help but it put something across about yourself, your reactions, your likes, your dislikes, your tastes, what kind of a person you are. So you are engaging in a form of narrative. We do it all of the time, whether we consider ourselves good storytellers or not. Nonetheless, there is the talking about oneself. That's fine in as far as it goes. The next level of this is to grasp the idea that stories have genre, they have theme. Obviously we know that you go into a library, there's the section for the westerns and the section for the horror stories and the romance stories and the kitchen sink dramas and all the rest of it. You have the different sections, we get that. But not only do books and novels have genres and themes, the idea is to extend that to human existence, so that when we are telling the story of our life, we organise in our own minds that narrative. We don't tell everything that's ever happened to us since the year dot, largely because we can't remember most of it, but even if you've got an eidetic memory, you still don't sit there and recount every single thing. You give the gist when you're talking about yourself. And that requires putting things in a certain order. What stories, what events from our lives do we consider important and worth telling? And what do we think are boring and irrelevant and we don't bother telling anyone? Or what do we think are embarrassing and we really don't want people to know about that? Even though they might be really interested in that. So in editing our lives and putting it across, the idea is that we tend to develop a theme about our lives and about who we are. For some people, the theme they put across may be that their life is a great adventure, they do all these exciting things, they go on wonderful holidays, they've met this famous person, and they've saved small children from burning buildings, and who knows what else they've done. Whether half of it is true or not is besides the point, but they see their life as adventurous and they put that across when they're telling. Other people, and particularly if we're thinking people in a therapeutic situation, a psychotherapeutic situation, which by its very nature tends to attract unhappy people, generally speaking, happy people don't bother spending money on therapists. You've got people who might view their life as a tragedy, and their role in their own life is not that of a great adventurer, but that of a victim, of horrible events, deaths and diseases and assaults and being lied to and cheated and used and abused and so on. And they'll often give a litany of all of the terrible things that have happened to them and why this person was horrible to them and why that person was horrible to them. And it's a very sad tale. A lot of comedy is also quite sad. Not just all the stereotypical tripe about the tears of a clown and the rest of it, but a lot of comedy spins on the fact that the difference between tragedy and funny is very, very thin, and it depends on your slant, your point of view, how you spin events. So there are people who have had terrible things happen to them, but when they tell the story, they tell it in a comedic fashion, intending to make their audience laugh, and portraying themselves not as a victim so much as a kind of a clown, if you like, a comic character in this funny saga. And the idea within the therapeutic uses of storytelling is to get people to, first off, identify what story they are telling. And this can, in some senses, it tracks back to people like Erich Berne, who developed transactional analysis and spoke of life scripts. There's more to it than just him, but he was a significant figure in helping to shape these ideas of narrative psychology and storytelling and celebrity. Do you put yourself across as the hero of your story? Do you put yourself across as the tragic victim? Do you put yourself across as the hardened survivor who has overcome terrible obstacles? Do you put yourself across as a villain, as a malicious character in your own story? And the point to bear in mind is that we can be many things to many people. There are some people in the world, 3 of them, who think I'm lovely and wonderful. There are some people in the world who think I'm the biggest bastard to ever walk the earth. There are some people who think I'm intelligent. There's some people who think I'm as thick as a plank. I could tell a story from any of their perspectives about me, and it would totally change the kind of person I come across as to whoever's listening to that story. Which one of those interpretations is the one that I think is the most important depends on me. If I value myself, I'm likely to put a more positive spin on the story I'm telling. If I hate and despise myself and want to tear myself into pieces, I might portray myself in a very negative light in one of these stories. If I am overwhelmed with unhappiness and sadness and despair, I might put myself across as a very tragic figure, the victim of forces beyond my control, things like that. Becoming aware of the story you're telling is the first step to stop telling it. And to think, is this the story I want to tell? So that rather than just unconsciously routine, the idea being that you tell the same story so often you forget you're telling it after all, it becomes second nature. And if you stop, you think, you pause, you analyse, maybe you speak to other people and say, how do I come across to you? What stories do I tell to you about me? And they feed back to you honestly, hopefully. It can be a surprise because you can suddenly realise the story you're telling is not one you actually want to tell. And you start to realise that if you go on and on about of, oh, I'm ugly, I'm awful, I'm useless, I'm thick, I'm this, I'm that, I'm all these negative things, perpetually putting yourself across as crap and worthless. Even if you weren't miserable to start with, you do that for a few months, let alone a few years, you soon will be miserable and unhappy. And it's that notion that the more negative you put yourself across as, the more wearing and exhausting and draining it becomes. Conversely, the more you can focus on positive portrayals of yourself, to think about your life story in a more positive light. I am a survivor, not a victim. It's what are the funny parts of my story? What are the adventurous parts of my story? What are the exciting parts of my story? Not everyone's going to have some massively dramatic tale to tell, but there are elements in most people's lives that could be put in a positive light with a little thought. And the idea is to think about not just storytelling in the sense of dragons and witches and wizards and ancient gods and fairy tales and so on, but also the narrative of our own life. What we tell other people about ourselves, what we tell ourselves about ourselves when we're in a reflected mood and thinking, oh, I've had a really wonderful life, I've had a shitty, terrible life, I've had a whatever kind of a life. What is the tale we are telling? And to bear in mind that all of these tales are fundamentally works of fiction because we take selective highlights. We choose to focus on the funny things, or the tragic things, or the things that make us seem intellectual, or the things that make us seem like complete fools. We are selecting the highlights and ignoring things that don't fit into the picture we're trying to create. So it's being very conscious of the picture you're trying to create and making sure the tale you tell is the one you want to tell. That the legacy you leave of yourself is the one you want to leave, and it's not just done in a kind of unthinking, unconscious way, but it's an intentional legacy. That perhaps seems a little bit wordy and what have you, but that idea that storytelling is not just a thing we do sitting around a campfire talking about dragons. It's a thing we do sitting on the bus chatting to the person next to us, telling them what kind of a day we had yesterday. That's storytelling. And whilst there's nothing wrong with having a bad day and saying yesterday was really dreadful and awful and I felt terrible and so on, or acknowledging your own, I did something really awful to another person and I feel dreadful about it and I wish I could put it right. Perfectly fine recognising our painful, dark, unpleasant experiences, but not to make that the dominant narrative, the only narrative of our lives, to recognise our lives are a mixture of positive and negative, joyful and tragic, funny and tedious, etc. And to take a more healthy overview of our lives. And for those people who are painfully shy, or who struggle to talk about themselves because they think no one else is even remotely interested, going on personal experience, I think there's probably an awful lot of people out there who are not just shy, but genuinely think of themselves as so dull, so boring, so worthless, so uninteresting, that they'll talk about whether it's dragons around the campfire or their favourite TV show or films or the woman next door, anything under the sun, rather than talk about themselves, because they're convinced nobody else will be interested, because fundamentally they're not interested in their own lives. They think of their own narrative as being a very boring one. I'm a dreary nobody, nothing happens to me ever. And there is a predictive element to this, a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you keep saying my life is tragic, my life is boring, my life is dreary and worthless, you make it so, even if it wasn't to start with. And conversely, of course, if you say my life is interesting and exciting and nice people I know and they're kind to me and I'm kind to them and so on, it helps to create an atmosphere in which positive things happen to you, because you start to draw towards you the things that you keep talking about and describing and creating in your narrative. So the idea of self-care is not that you go on and on and on about yourself in a narcissistic way and really do bore everyone to tears because you've got nothing else to talk about but me. Rather, that it's on those occasions when you choose to talk about yourself, you do so in a constructive way that lifts your own spirit. And if you're positive, the audience gain a benefit from that positivity. It rubs off to a degree. So as a therapeutic process, coming back to what I was saying earlier, that it's not just the client of the therapist, but the therapist themselves. It's a meeting, a two-way street, in which healing takes place for the person telling the story and the person hearing the story. If you want more of a pagan spin on that, the ancient Greeks believed that just sitting and listening to someone telling the theogony, the story, the great creation myths of ancient Greece, was a magical act, a healing, transformative act for the audience and also for the person reciting the story. It was an engagement with the gods. You tell the story of the gods appear. And they live through the storyteller and move into the audience, the ones hearing, listening, and in their minds participating in that story, being in the world created by the storyteller. So you've got two levels there, both telling your own story and how we tell the stories of the gods, how we tell the stories of our ancestors, the animal spirits, the plant spirits, the rock spirits, the river spirits. Everyone benefits, I would argue, if we're coming at this from an animist point of view, from having their story told and known. To listen to the stories of the river, to listen to the stories of the trees, to listen to the stories of the rocks, but also to listen to your own story, because you are as much a part of nature as that oak tree, that lake, that mountain. Their stories are worth listening to, but so is yours. And so, by implication, are other people's. To sit, and we often these days are more conscious perhaps of the impact of loneliness on the elderly, where their families have moved away, half the people they used to know are dead already, and they become more and more isolated. That's not just something experienced by the elderly. There's an increasing recognition that it's experienced by people of all ages. And this frigging internet doesn't really help, to be honest, because it creates the illusion you're talking to people, but you're not really. It's just a lot of people standing in the dark shouting and imagining that other people are listening to them shouting. We don't have face-to-face engagement as much, maybe, as we did pre-internet, when people would talk to whoever was sitting next to them rather than sitting there glaring at their screen and ignoring who is next to them. So taking the time to listen to somebody else, to hear who they are, both by what they say about themselves, but also what they leave out. What haven't they mentioned? What are they keeping quiet about, either because they think it's boring or because they're too embarrassed to mention it, or any one of a dozen other motivations for not saying things. Listening to the silence as much as listening to the words, and then sharing your story, because it should be a two-way street. It's not just, I'm going to perform to you, you sit there nodding like a little lapdog, and then you go away again. It's an interaction. The more interaction, the better in that sense, because it becomes a relationship, and that's something which, if it's a kind relationship, is very, very healing. It's very therapeutic. It's very beneficial to emotionally open to another human being and engage with them. Not everyone you meet, admittedly, but having emotional intimacy, and I don't mean romance or sex or anything like that, but just a friendship, a person, a work colleague, a teacher, a pupil, whoever it might be, whatever kind of a dynamic is going on, someone you can sit and be open with and engage with, and they hear your life and you hear their life. And you do hear it. That's the important thing, is to listen well as to tell well. And building that up. So that's my 2 penneth worth on the idea of storytelling as a form of self-care, and encouraging it and why it's a worthwhile thing to engage in. Give it a go if you don't already. Thank you.